What Emerson needs when it comes to the transcendental hero is somebody who's not too dangerous. Why not be, since he's the theoretician and he has all the ideas of transcendentalism anyway, why not promote himself as Mr. Transcendentalism? He doesn't live it. He talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. When you look at Emerson's life, he certainly doesn't look like an outlaw. Remember that he did give up his pulpit after his first wife dies, when he says he doesn't believe in communion anymore. And he's so charismatic that they offer to get another minister in to do communion if he'll just preach the sermon, and he still won't do it. Well, quitting that job would make him look like an outlaw to everybody else. But that's really about the last outlaw thing that he really does. Again, he's got that nice big white house on the side of the road, and he lives on the money from his first wife that he inherited. He marries again. He has children. He even works to some extent when he travels around as a public speaker. There's just no scandal that I can think of in Emerson's life. So he doesn't look different enough to be a transcendental hero. Remember, transcendental hero, you're supposed to be living by your own morality. And he just doesn't seem to be doing that. He really seems to live by traditional morality. Margaret Fuller's too scary. And there are several things that make Thoreau the perfect choice for the poster boy of transcendentalism. And the first is, when you look at Emerson's essay on Thoreau, which is where he really develops Thoreau as the one who lives the life. It didn't start out as an essay. Anybody know what it started out as? It started out as a eulogy. Thoreau is in his early 40s when he dies, and Emerson writes that as the oration for Thoreau's funeral. And that has several advantages when you start making Thoreau larger than life. The first thing is, being dead is probably the first qualification any kind of a hero. If you have a movement and you want to have a hero for it, make him dead. Why?
You can really make him anything you want because he's not going to do anything in his life to disprove it or...
It's not going to make you look bad. I mean, if you say, Henry David Thoreau, Mr. Transcendentalism, the most spiritual man in America, cares nothing about materialism, and the next day he's selling Henry David Thoreau, Mr. Transcendentalism t-shirts for $50 a piece, you're going to look like a fool. But if he's dead, he's not going to make those mistakes. And generally when people die, the evidence starts to get lost almost immediately. The more you tell the story of somebody's life, the more it becomes their life, whether it really was or not. And who's going to, when he starts to tell you about all these great qualities that Thoreau has, who's going to stand up at the funeral and say, come on, Waldo, the guy was a total loser. He couldn't keep a job. He couldn't establish a relationship. He had no direction to his life. He never made any kind of money. He was just a failure all around. Until he came to transcendentalism, he was just a bum. Then he became a transcendentalist, and all of a sudden it became all right. Give us a break here. This is not some kind of hero everybody look up to. Nobody's going to stand up at the funeral and say that. So Emerson can pretty much say what he wants. And then when he turns that into the essay on Thoreau, if you didn't contradict them initially, how can you stand up now and say it's not true? Right from the very beginning, he certainly does create... Now, and here's something of significance, that when he writes this thing, how many of you felt from reading that he had a real, almost hero worship for Thoreau? That he really admired him, and they were the closest of friends? They aren't. They had been. Well, what happens is this. Thoreau meets Emerson when he gets out of college. Emerson's already a pretty big name. He's brought out his first book of essays. Transcendentalism is a movement already. He's a pretty important guy. And again, Emerson had this habit of collecting people that he thought were going to turn into somebody. And he was always disappointed in them. And most of the time he was disappointed in them not because of what they turned out to be, because they didn't turn out to be what he thought they ought to be. Does that square with Emerson's philosophy?
No, because
No.
if it did, then they would have turned out to be themselves. It wouldn't have been what Thoreau wanted them to be to begin with.
Emerson should have said, you turned out to be you. Wow, that's great. That was the whole idea. But instead he says, you didn't turn out to be who I thought you were going to be. And he's not a real good judge of character. I can't think of the name of the guy who was the poet that he picked. And the guy was a terrible poet. And everybody thought he was a terrible poet except Emerson. And Emerson expects him to blossom into this great poet of America, and he never does. And Emerson holds it against him because he doesn't. Alcott had some real good ideas about education, but he wasn't very good at living a life. So he wasn't anybody you could really point to and have anybody else follow. Nobody was going to follow Bronson Alcott because he didn't know where he was going. And he arranged a lot of things for Alcott, but he's disappointed in him because he doesn't turn out to be the success that he thought he was going to be. He thinks Thoreau, as almost everybody did when Thoreau was young, he thinks Thoreau has an awful lot of potential. And he thinks Thoreau could be the guy who can live transcendentalism. And at first, they get along really well. Thoreau lives in Emerson's house for 2 years. He is the handyman. And later on, when Emerson goes to Europe, now they've been friends a long time, he's encouraged Thoreau all along. He keeps trying to find jobs for Thoreau. You notice at the end of Hawthorne's journal entry on Thoreau, he talks about Thoreau going to Long Island to become a tutor. That was for Emerson's nephew. Emerson had arranged that so that Thoreau would have a steady job, and so he would be close enough to New York to go in and market his book, and he would have enough free time which he could combine with the tutoring to create a series of lectures that he could make money by going around and giving. And Thoreau, of course, isn't able to sell the book, sets up a bunch of lectures, but they're so detailed that they lost the audiences right and left. So Thoreau never became the great speaker that Emerson was. Emerson was kind of training him to be Emerson, really, which, of course, is the last thing Emerson should have been doing. Their falling out comes when, I think it's 1850. So Thoreau's got to be in his late 30s, early 40s. It's not that long before his death. And Emerson goes off on a trip to England. Now, Emerson's family relationships, his first wife was really his true love. She was 19 when he married her. She died within a year of tuberculosis. Emerson never got over that. He marries Lydian. I don't remember Lydian's maiden name. In fact, her name isn't even Lydian, it's Lydia. But when he marries her, Emerson says, look, we're going to New England, we're going to move out into the country. Everybody there adds an R on the end of everything. They're going to start calling you Lydia. I can't stand that, so I'm going to change your name to Lydian. This is Mr. Be Yourself. I'm going to change your name because you're my wife. That certainly doesn't seem to square with his philosophy. Lydian is, she may not be his true love, but I think Emerson may well have been hers. A kind of mystical thing happens when they first meet. Now, she is 30 when he marries her. Anybody know what age they gave up on trying to get you married in those days? 23. 23, they weren't even inviting eligible bachelors over on the long shot that maybe they'll become attracted to you. They just assumed you're going to be an old maid, you're going to help raise your children's kids, you're going to take care of your parents when they're old, you're going to do a lot of community work. And everybody's going to pity you because you never reached the epitome of a woman's life, marriage, and children. She had lived on her own and with her sister, so a woman living on her own under her own, that she had been free. She was a woman who had actually been free. They were very intellectual, and they did a lot of thinking and a lot of reading, and they were a lot in a way like Margaret Fuller. She doesn't get famous like Margaret Fuller, but women had a lot of respect for Lydian and what Lydian had to say. In any case, Emerson is coming to town to give a lecture, and Lydian wants to go, but she hasn't really got anything to wear, and she has a couple of friends who want to go also, and the friend had this dress that she said, well, I've had this thing altered 4 or 5 times, and it just doesn't fit me right. Do you want to try it on? And it was the dress. You women know what the dress is, right? A long time ago, my sister was in a tornado down in Texas. And as it came towards their house, she got in the car and she grabbed 2 things, her birth control pill and the dress. Because she'd never get that one again. It's the one you look perfect in. Lydian puts it on and it's the dress. Now Lydian was kind of regal looking. She wasn't gorgeous, but she was very kind of majestic and aristocratic looking. And she looked the best in this dress that she had ever looked. She goes to the lecture, and Emerson is delivering the lecture, looking at Lydian the whole time. And about 2 weeks later, they get to meet personally, and it's not too long after that they get married. But it's pretty clear to Lydian that Emerson's in love with her mind. It's not the grand passion. It's not what he had with his first wife, and he hasn't stopped being in love with his first wife. And she accepted that, probably with the assumption that sooner or later he would come to love her. Well, Emerson's not a real touchy-feely kind of guy. He's a minister. He's kind of restrained and aloof. He's not real good at being affectionate. I'm sure Emerson had deep feelings, but he wasn't good at expressing it for people. And Lydian kept, I think, expecting that expression, and she never got it. Same thing with his children. Emerson was really more of a mentor to them, a kind of a teacher. He loved them, but unlike Thoreau, he couldn't get down and wrestle around with them and give them piggyback rides and things. And of course, Thoreau could. Now, when Emerson goes off to, so one other thing about Emerson, he said, and he recognized this in himself, he said, I'm just not good with sick people. Part of that probably came from watching his first wife die of tuberculosis. But he says, I just can't generate a sympathy for them. I know it's not their fault they're sick, but I really can't help feeling it is. Remember, this is Aunt Mary Moody coming in saying it's all an opportunity to be a hero. You get sick, you ought to rise above that and keep on going and do what you need to do. So anybody who couldn't do that looked kind of, I'm sure Emerson wouldn't have said so, but looked kind of like a weakling to Emerson. And so he just wasn't very sympathetic. Lydian is sick pretty often after they lose their first child, Waldo, when he's about 5 years old. And of course, good reason for that. It's quite possible that Lydian was addicted to laudanum. Now, laudanum was the standard drug. Instead of giving somebody, what's the drug you get now if you're upset? Valium. So it's just like Valium, that doctors prescribed it, right? Now remember, any woman who had an opinion was obviously on the borderline of a nervous breakdown, so she had to get Valium. And anyone that was emotional, too emotional, because they didn't like the emotions, they wanted them controlled, they would have given laudanum to. And it may have been that she was addicted to laudanum, and what she thought was illness was really the side effects of laudanum addiction. Because she would get up in the morning and take her medicine. Well, she wouldn't get up. She would get up in the afternoon and take her medicine. And then she'd be good for a while. And she would forget that she was ever sick. And her daughter wrote, Mother gets up sick every day. But once she's taken her medicine, she thinks she's a healthy person, but she isn't. And some of that may have been the after effects. In any case, she had migraines. She got sick fairly easily by Emerson's standard, and he wasn't real sympathetic. Now, when he goes to England, you can't leave a woman alone, of course, even one who's in her 40s. So guess who he has house and wife sick? Thoreau. Like what, weren't there any 12-year-olds around he could have gotten cheaper? Henry David Thoreau, this is not a guy you'd expect going to run a household. But what happens is Thoreau moves into the house and he really likes, and he's astounded at this, he likes having a family and being the head of the household. And he loves the kids, he always had, and he plays with them all the time. And he writes to Emerson and says, Waldo, you better come home. The kids are starting to call me Daddy. I'm getting to like it. And Emerson doesn't come home. And Lydian keeps sending him his letters saying, you know, Waldo, it's time to come home. And he still doesn't come home. And she writes him a couple letters that seem to be saying that you never say it. He never says he loves her. And he says, I know I never say it, I just can't say it. Because he's really still in love with his first wife. So that's pretty hard on Mrs. Emerson. She's sick. Not only is Thoreau running the household, but Thoreau is nursing her. Now, Thoreau's brother died of lockjaw. There was tuberculosis in his family. He was used to sickness. He was used to helping nursing people. It didn't disgust him at all. And so he sat with Lydian and put the cold compresses on her head, and read to her, and held her hand and talked to her, and fell in love with her. Now the reason we know that is because in his journal, he talks about an older woman that is the center of the universe. That there's just nobody like her in the world, and he's not going to be able to see her anymore, and he's absolutely heartbroken over it. There is no indication that Lydian and Thoreau had an affair, that they ever consummated it, or that Lydian ever really saw him as more than really a dutiful son, because she's almost old enough to be his mother. Nevertheless, I'm sure she loved Thoreau. And Thoreau loved her, but of course, remember Thoreau is Mr. Morality. Everybody says, you know, you just soon think of putting your arm around a tree as Henry Thoreau. He's just so rigid in his beliefs. So I'm sure that he would not have slept with Lydian even if she had slept with him, and that just wasn't even a question between them. But he does fall in love with her. When Emerson comes home, Thoreau is absolutely appalled, because here's Emerson, the guy who said we need a literature by Americans, for Americans, about Americans, and he comes back from England wearing British clothes with a whole lot of British slang in his language, talking about how wonderful the British are. The guy who had set up the Transcendental Club, which is where Transcendentalism sprang from, to talk about ideas, now wants to set up a country club, from which supposedly he blackballed Frederick Douglass because he was black. Nobody knows for sure if he did that because it's a secret ballot, but that's part of the legend. I mean, just the idea of setting up a country club which is exclusive, that's horrendous from a guy who's always preached that everybody is unique and an individual, one of a kind, and Thoreau is horrified. And Thoreau tells him, you've turned into the biggest phony there is. I mean, look at what you used to be. Emerson, of course, is upset with that. He's upset because the children love Thoreau, and Thoreau can relate to him in a way that he can't, and he knows that's a shortcoming in himself. And then Lydian, Lydian told him how Thoreau took care of her all the time. Emerson was away when she was sick. And no matter what she thought of Thoreau, it had to be in her voice. How much she loved and admired Thoreau. Well, you're a guy who everybody in the country thinks is such a wonderful human being, and your wife thinks is a guy an awful lot better than you. That's got to hurt. And so they have a falling out. Now, earlier on, Thoreau had written a book, and Emerson told him it was a great book. And when he couldn't find a publisher, Emerson said, publish it yourself, everybody will love it. Thoreau went into debt. I mean, imagine Thoreau going $2,000 in debt. I mean, $2,000 in 1845 or so, that's an incredible amount of money. It took him 5 years of giving up pieces of his life to pay that off. And when they have the fight, Emerson tells him, I never liked that book. It was a lousy book to begin with, and it's no wonder it didn't sell. And Thoreau goes home and writes in his journal, I never asked but one thing of my friend, and that was the truth. I never got it until he became my enemy. After that, they're still talking to one another. Thoreau drops by occasionally when there are other people around. but it's not this almost father and son relationship that they had had in the past. So when Emerson writes this essay, he doesn't have these feelings that Thoreau is the be-all and end-all of transcendentalism. He had a lot of misgivings about Thoreau, and they weren't all that good friends anymore. So you really have to question Emerson's intent in this. In other words, is he really trying to make amends to a dead friend that he felt he had treated badly? Or is he really just trying to create a transcendental hero that everybody can look up to? Because almost all the way through, that's what he seems to be trying to create. The first thing he tells us is that Thoreau made a pencil, made the perfect pencil. Now at the time, American pencils were very soft. The lead in them was soft and it smudged easily, and it wasn't anywhere near as good as the European pencils. And he says that Thoreau, and he presents it as if Thoreau had this magical insight, because he's part of the Transcendent One, that allowed him to make this pencil. First of all, when Thoreau makes the pencil, what does everybody think he's going to do now? Yeah, go into the pencil business. He's the only American who can make hard lead pencils. He would have made a fortune. I mean, everybody used a pencil. And he doesn't. Why not? Why does he say he's not going to make another pencil?
Because he did it right the first time, so why repeat?
I did it once. I'm going to spend my whole life doing the same thing over and over again. I'm Henry David Thoreau. I've got lots and lots and lots of talents and abilities. I'm going to keep doing the same one trick over again all my life. Conversely, you can look at that as saying that Thoreau maybe didn't go into the pencil business because he was afraid of failure. His parents owned a pencil factory. Again, it wasn't a big factory with lots of employees. It was a little shed off the side of the house. The family glued the pencils together with the lead and boxed them. And occasionally when they had a big order, they hired one other person. Thoreau had worked in that since the time he was a kid. The family was always on the brink of bankruptcy. The only time the business ever made money was related to that making the perfect pencil. They didn't go into the hard pencil business, but Thoreau had discovered a method of making graphite stick together so that they could print pictures now in the newspapers much clearer. And that was worth some money for a little while. But they never got rich at it. And so some people have argued Thoreau didn't not make the perfect pencil and become a pencil entrepreneur because he didn't want to do something twice. It was because he was afraid he was going to fail like his father had failed with the business. Let's take a break until 8:30. So we can't be sure about Thoreau's motivation just from what Emerson says about it. And he's always trying to create out of Thoreau this transcendental hero that he can point to. It's true that from a transcendentalist perspective, Thoreau is successful. Remember, being successful doesn't mean making a lot of money. It means getting paid to do what you like to do. And Thoreau loves to measure things. And Emerson makes a point of saying that he's a surveyor, and that he has a skill for measuring things, and that it's something he loves to do. So he's certainly a success in that regard, although later on, Emerson will criticize him by saying that he could have been a captain of industry, but instead he just wanted to be the captain of a Huckleberry Party. Well, if Thoreau wanted to be the captain of the Huckleberry Party, what should Emerson have said about that? That's great. That's what Thoreau wants to do. He's being himself. In fact, the last thing in the world that Thoreau wants to do is become a captain of industry. One of the reasons why I think he doesn't, if you take him from the way Emerson presents him, and you see him as a true transcendental hero, the last thing in the world he would have wanted to be was the boss of something. Thoreau can work when he wants to work, because he only works to supply his immediate needs, except until Emerson gets him into debt. But other than that, he works to his own rhythm. if he becomes, let's say he decides to make those hard lead pencils, what will happen to his life?
You won't have control of it.
You don't want to control it anymore. When you start to run a business, it's not the same as when you work in a business. Thoreau can say, the geese are flying over, and go out and watch them. When you're the boss, you can't do that. You've got to show up earlier than your employees. You've got to work, you've got to be there all the time. When you set up a small business, and I'm sure it's the same in the 19th century it is in the 20th, you've got 3 years worth of 15-hour days ahead of you before you even begin to break even. One, Thoreau's not willing to put in that kind of effort, and two, that would be the exact opposite of what Thoreau would want to be. 15 hours a day working at the same thing, Henry David Thoreau, that would be intolerable. He would have to be the boss. He would have to be somebody he wasn't. Thoreau doesn't want to tell people how to do things. Thoreau just wants to do what he wants to do. So he really escapes from being an entrepreneur. And yet Emerson felt somehow that he could have been one, and that was a failing in Thoreau. When in fact, from Emerson's own philosophy, he should have probably thought just the opposite. He lists a series of things, each of which would have made Thoreau seem an outlaw to his neighbors. For example, he was bred to no profession. He had a college degree at a time when few middle-class people had a college degree from Harvard. And yet he didn't do anything much with it. He surveyed, but he could have done that without going to Harvard for it. So it looks like he has no steady job. Remember, he teaches for a little while. He resigns from that. He did teach in his brother's school until his brother died. But he doesn't continue the school on his own. He digs ditches. He's a handyman for Emerson. He works odd jobs. I mean, here's a guy with, again, an advanced degree, and he makes no use of it. That makes him look like an outlaw. This is in America with an expanding frontier, with opportunities for everybody, when the village loafer was a stock comic figure. The guy who didn't do any work. He wasn't much admired. He wasn't, the village loafer was not somebody anybody looked up to, and he wasn't even somebody who was tolerated all that much. Generally, he coincided with the town drunk, and to that extent he was accepted, but the village loafer is not somebody that's admirable, and so a guy like Thoreau doesn't work all the time, looks like an outlaw to the people around him. He never married. Well, why, if you wanted to be yourself at all costs, wouldn't you marry?
And your responsibilities to others, not yourself.
First of all, you get married in the 19th century, what's going to follow almost immediately?
Children.
Children. It's like Francis Bacon said, "He that wife and children hath given hostages to fate." You can't quit anymore. Once you have kids, you can starve on your own, but when your kids are starving, you got to go out and work, whether you want to or not. So you don't have any decisions. Your options close down. You have kids, your life is basically over. And because they'll be your kids forever. You go to the hospital and go to the ICU and you'll see some 90-year-old dying in there, and their 75-year-old child will come, and the minute they hit that door, they turn into a child. That relationship never ends. So if he gets married, he's going to have responsibilities that'll keep him from being who he is. He's not going to be able to make those choices anymore. And even if he doesn't have children, you get married to somebody, can you do whatever you want to do from then on? No, you gotta rent the chick movies half of the time, and the ones with the nudity and explosions the other half. Everybody starts to make compromises. You can't do whatever you want to do. Anytime you get involved in any kind of long-term relationship, you have to make compromises on who you are. And if you really want to be a transcendental hero, you can't make any of those compromises. So it may be that Thoreau, rather than give up his individuality in order to be himself to the fullest possible extent, sacrifices the pleasure of having somebody else to care about and having children. Remember, in the 19th century, being married and having children was the highest success you could have. And Thoreau, and that you were, not just women, but men as well, really had a failed life if you didn't get married and have children. And so from everybody's point of view, Thoreau is an outlaw not to do that, to not get married. You can, generally, if a man was unmarried, there was a general conspiracy to get him married, because there was some woman out there that he could be taking care of that can't get a job on her own because there aren't any for her. On the other hand, if you look at it that way, Thoreau's a transcendental hero. He gives up the pleasures of marriage in order to be himself. On the other hand, there's a picture of Thoreau on the back. Hawthorne described him as ugly as sin, and even Emerson, who's trying to say every good thing he can about Thoreau, said that he was rugged looking. What does rugged looking mean? Yeah, kind of gnarly, kind of rough looking. He wasn't good, he was ugly. It means ugly, basically. I was like 40 before I found that out. My wife used to tell me, you're rugged good looking. And I found out rugged meant ugly. By then it didn't really matter anyway. So Thoreau is not a good looking guy, so what's his chances of getting married? They're not real good, and even if he had been a good looking guy, what were his chances of getting married? Not very good. Why not? What does a woman look for in a husband in those days?
Responsibility, good job, property.
Good job, money, the ability to raise a family. Thoreau hasn't got it. You can bet that when Thoreau shows up, I mean, you know, before you took anybody out, you didn't even get to see her until you talked with her father. And he said, well, Mr. Thoreau, I understand that you went to Harvard College. That's certainly an achievement. What do you do now? Huckleberry captain, and I've dug ditches, I survey, taught for a little while. Thank you very much. Just leave your application with the secretary. He'd never gotten back in. Now, Thoreau does seem to have had at least one infatuation when he's young. When he's in his early 20s, he and his brother are in love with the same girl. She comes to visit Concord for the summer, and they're both friendly rivals for her affection. But his brother asks her to marry, and she turns him down. So Henry says, well, if she won't marry you, do you care if I ask? And his brother Charles loved him and said, no, go ahead. And she turns Thoreau down as well. Now, we don't know whether she turned him down or if she even saw the letter, if her father didn't just write back and say, no way. Everybody knew, though, that Thoreau had been turned down. If you're an ugly guy and you ask a woman to dance and she says no, believe me, it's a long time before you go and do that again. So Thoreau, having been dumped once, is not like, I mean, Thoreau was a realistic kind of guy. He probably had to look at himself and go, well, you're not beautiful, and you don't have any money, and you're not likely to get any. And that's all that really matters now in the husbanding trade. You're never going to get married, so give it up. Later on in his 30s, there was a woman who thought that he had proposed and wrote back to him accepting it. And Thoreau was horrified. He wrote to her and said, I don't know what I said that made you think that I was proposing marriage, but I'm just not a person who can be married. I have a great deal of esteem for you, but I don't know where you got that idea. But I don't want to get married, no thank you. So he never gets married. Now again, that makes him look like an outlaw. He lived alone. Well, not really. He lived with the Emersons for a little while. He lived with his family. I'm not sure if the only time he didn't live, that he actually lived alone, was the year and a half that he lived in Walden Pond. And it was only a year and a half. And everybody thinks of Thoreau as having gone off into the wilderness and lived like this guru on a mountaintop that never saw anybody. And it wasn't like that at all. If you go to Concord, Thoreau's cabin is less than a mile out the back door and across the property of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's less than a mile in the other direction from his parents' house, which is where he lived most of the time. I had two maiden aunts that doted on him as well. And so It wasn't like Thoreau didn't have a place to sleep. Anytime Thoreau wanted a hot meal and a warm bed, he just had to drop in at the Ants. Whenever they saw the muddy clothes laying on the floor, they said, "Oh, Henry's here, make him some cookies, get him some milk." They just loved and adored him. So it's kind of like those 60s hippies that dropped out to live in the commune with daddy's credit card in their shoe. There was always a safety net under Henry David Thoreau. So he's not the kind of homeless person you would think of today. He wasn't without resources. And again, when he lives alone, when he's at Walden Pond, he had visitors. He didn't have them all the time. People didn't just drop in on Thoreau, because Thoreau would tell you, "Go away, I don't want to talk to you today." Just like when he has his walks. And he says he has no walks to waste on fools. He would tell you flat out, "No, you talk too much and you never say anything anyway. When I go on my walks, I want to commune with nature, so you can't come. You're too annoying." So if you showed up, Thoreau would have said, "No, I don't want to be bored today, go away." So a lot of people didn't just show up, but if they wandered by, and there were paths near his cabin that you could see whether Thoreau was out or not, and you'd wave, and if Thoreau waved you over, then you would go and visit him. Otherwise, you just wave and keep on walking. Notice he says even the Irish laborers visited him on their way back. On the way out, they kind of went by like this, because they were going to buy whiskey on the far side of the railroad. And they were a little bit drunk when they came back, and they always dropped in at Thoreau's house, and they offered him some from the jug, and Thoreau politely turned it down, but he enjoyed their company. So it wasn't like he was this hermit that never saw anybody even then. So he doesn't live anywhere near as alone as Emerson implies that he does. He never went to church. Then, as now, the vast majority of people who profess to practice a religion, to believe in a religion, don't practice it. If there is a universal religion, it's not deism, it's hypocrisy. But everybody did belong to a church in Thoreau's day. That was the main social institution in the small town. To not belong was almost un-American. So again, he looks like an outlaw. Well, why wouldn't Thoreau want to belong to a church? Why wouldn't any transcendentalist belong to a church?
So they're part of a group of the same line of thought, they're not individuals.
Right, it's got a theology, it's got a set of things that you have to believe. You have to follow your heart. Thoreau, and a transcendentalist is in church anywhere they are, especially when they go into the woods. So Thoreau was in church most of the time. To him, the idea of joining a church or joining anything would have been preposterous. He never voted. Well, neither do 60-some% of Americans now. But in Thoreau's day, 90% or better voted. Everybody voted. I mean, everything closed down on election day. People went to the polls, they voted, they hung out and stood around and talked, and they talked to everybody else who came to vote. And they knew who came and who didn't come. And they were very proud of being able to vote. They were the only people in the world who could really do it. They thought that was a miraculous thing. It wasn't a gift that they took lightly. And to not vote, whoever you voted for, looked un-American. And Thoreau doesn't vote, and so he looks like an outlaw. But Thoreau couldn't have voted. If you vote, it implies that you're willing to abide by majority rule. What does Thoreau think of majority rule? One man in the right is a majority of one. He doesn't care about majority rule. In fact, he says the only reason majority rule works is because 51% of the people can beat up 49% of the people. It's not based on any great moral principle, it's based on physical violence. But it makes him look like an outlaw. He refused to pay a tax to the state. Thoreau didn't intend. Now, a lot of people think that Thoreau went to prison for his ideals. He is not Nelson Mandela. He wasn't in jail for 20 years. How long was he in jail? One day, overnight. Didn't intend to go to jail anyway. Went to town to get shoes and hadn't paid his poll tax. Under the argument that, why should I pay a tax for the poll when I don't vote? The sheriff arrests him and puts him in jail. And it's not Rikers Island. I'm not sure whether Thoreau would even have stayed the night. He'd have found the money somewhere if they'd have put him on Rikers Island, I'm sure. It's this nice little country jail. They didn't even make the prisoners go inside their cells until 6 o'clock. And he stayed up all night because he was on the 2nd floor. And 2-story buildings were pretty big then, in a small town like that. He had never seen the town from up there, so he was on the bars all night long. I mean, you couldn't lock Thoreau up anyway. Thoreau was interested in it. You put Thoreau, lock Thoreau in a closet, come back the next day, Thoreau says, "Oh, shut the door. It's so big in here when it's dark. You would never guess this if I hadn't been in a closet all night. This is great. You're going to come in if you want, but shut the door." Doesn't matter where you lock him up. And he says, the dangerous part of me was my ideas. And that was out all night long. They didn't lock them up and couldn't lock them up. So it wasn't like he had had this terrible hardship. Now, our book says that he got out when a friend paid the tax. It's more likely that it was one of his aunts who came down and paid the tax. Well, why didn't Thoreau say to her, "No, no, I'm here on principle. It's a bad tax, I'm not paying it"? Why didn't he let her pay it?
Well, that's what she wanted to do, and she had the right to do it.
He's a transcendentalist. It's not right for me to do. But ants like paying taxes for you. Who am I to stand in their way? That's how convenient some of these beliefs are for Thoreau. She wanted to do it, so she had the right to do it if she wanted. And he let her keep on paying that tax. You notice he didn't go back to jail again, and it wasn't because he ever paid it. He felt it was wrong for him, but everybody has to make their own choice. And if she thought it was right to pay her tax and his, that was okay with him. Also, and you notice he doesn't insist on staying in jail either. When she pays, he gets out. And he got his shoe and went off and led a huckleberry party. Because he said, all right, I went on principle. And the people who understood the significance of what I was doing understood it in one day. They wouldn't understand it any better in 10 days or 100 days than they do now. And besides, I have other things to do. I was a prisoner for one night. I made one pencil. I'm not going to spend my life doing that. And he goes back out into the world. The legend is that when he's in jail, remember he's the one that says that in an unjust society, the only place for a just man is in prison. That Emerson supposedly comes down to visit him and says, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" Henry says, "Waldo, what are you doing out there? If you really cared, you'd be in here with me." Of course, although a lot of his neighbors didn't understand why he went to jail, they just thought he was a jailbird, and they did that to him to represent the bars, and they made fun of him. So a lot of them didn't get the point of it anyway, so it wasn't probably wouldn't have been any use staying in jail any longer than he was. He ate no flesh. Franklin was a vegetarian, but you notice there's a big difference. Why is Ben Franklin a vegetarian? To make money. It was cheaper, he could use the money, he buys the books and all. Thoreau doesn't believe in killing things. If you're going to eat things, you have to kill them first, so he doesn't do it. Now, of course, being a vegetarian in a place where everybody wanted meat in their diet makes you look like an outlaw. He drank no wine. Americans, again, were major league drinkers. So again, he looks, even though you would think drinking might make him look like an outlaw now, then it made him look like an outlaw not to drink, because everybody else did. He never knew the use of tobacco. He did smoke occasionally. He smoked the lily pads, some things off the lily pads he talks about smoking. And you notice at the very end he has some favorite plants. Mecania scandens, climbing hempweed. What's hemp? Pot, marijuana. And you don't have to smoke it, you can eat it. Thoreau was a guy, he was a naturalist that said, what does this stuff taste like? So Thoreau would have eaten the leaves off the hemp, I'm sure. So maybe some of that communing with nature in the wilds was just Thoreau being wrecked. In fact, there is an entry in his journal. He discovered a mushroom, and he made a drawing of it. And mainly his comments on it was that it was so phallic looking. But the mushroom from the picture is Amanita muscaria. Amanita muscaria is the magic mushroom. It produces an LSD-like substance. Everybody thinks it's poison. But Thoreau notices that the squirrels nibble it and just run around in circles and bang their heads on the tree. They don't die. So you know what Thoreau would have done. He would have taken a bite as well. So Thoreau is sitting there, and the sky is turning colors, and everything is melting into everything else. What does Thoreau think? Wow, am I wrecked?
No, he thinks this is cool.
This is the way I'm seeing through the illusion of nature, directly to the oversoul. He thinks he's having a transcendent experience. But as far as everybody else is concerned, he doesn't. Now, everybody used tobacco. Even children chewed tobacco. When Dickens comes through in 1842 and writes American Notes, he says, every man, woman, and child in America chews tobacco and spits it wherever they are. If you drop a glove in America, don't even reach down to pick it up, because you'll never get it clean again. It'll be so saturated with tobacco. So a place where even children chew tobacco, not chewing tobacco makes you look like an outlaw. And though a naturalist, he used neither trap nor gun. Now on the surface of it, you think, well, he doesn't eat meat, so you don't have to trap many vegetables, and shooting them is just counterproductive. But in fact, he's really 100 years ahead of his time. This is a place where he has insights into future morality. In his time, naturalists, natural scientists, studied animals by locking them up in pens and cages, or by killing them and taking them apart. How does Thoreau study animals? He observes them. He goes out and sits in the woods. And occasionally he would write letters to the professor of natural history at Harvard and correct them. And would say to him, look, if you spent more than 2 weeks in the summer following this animal, you would know what it does in the winter. And I don't have time to keep correcting you. So get out in the woods and watch them. Now that idea of studying animals by not interfering with them, that doesn't become an idea really generally until Jane Goodall studies the apes by going and living with them and following them around and staying on the outskirts of their community the whole time, not interfering with them at all, not harming them in any way. In other words, he's a 150 years or 140 years ahead of his time. He's acting in terms of the future morality by not killing animals and by studying them, by living with them. He chose wisely, no doubt, for himself to be the bachelor of thought and nature. He had no talent for wealth, and he knew how to be poor without the least hint of squalor or inelegance. Well, why aren't the poor elegant? Why are they always so squalid? Why do the poor always seem so shabby and disreputable?
Because they think of themselves as poor.
Because they think of themselves as poor. Thoreau is rich. Thoreau has everything he needs. That's all anybody could ask. There are countless people in America who had more than Thoreau, many of whom everybody would have considered having vast wealth, but they didn't have enough. That's almost always the key to the rich, that they never have enough. And no matter how much they have, they're empty. And so they're never really elegant either. And the poor, because America has always looked down on the poor, and it goes all the way back to the Puritans. Work is God's work. Work is inherently good. If you work and you're doing God's work, you'll get success. Getting money, remember, was a proof of election. Well, not having money must be proof of God's displeasure against you. So America's always despised the poor. And when the society despises people, they come to despise themselves. And the poor always feel bad about themselves for not having enough. Thoreau feels like he has plenty. So he's never ashamed, and so he is elegant in his poverty. And of course, he didn't want to carry on an account of what he had anyway. No opposition or ridicule had any weight with him. He coldly and fully stated his opinion without affecting to believe that it was opinion of the company. It was no consequence if everyone present held the opposite opinion. So why can't you sway Thoreau from his opinion? Why shouldn't you be able to?
Because it's his opinion.
It's his opinion. You should have yours. And Thoreau will... Now, the Transcendentalists argued all the time, but they had this problem. if they started to win the argument, they had to back off. Why?
Because then you were coming to their conclusion, and that was not what they wanted you to do.
They wanted you to come to your conclusion. As soon as they start to win, they're making you them. They got to stop. And they love to argue. And they each have their own opinion. Now, well, why even state what your opinion is then if you're not going to try to convert people to it? Because you have to express it. You're here to be you and to express that unique version of the good which you are. And that means not only expressing it in the way that you live, but in the way that you talk as well. So as much as they all like to argue, and they argued with one another, but none of them were ever going to change. They had their view of what was true, and that was what they should hold on to. Now they could discover new versions of what they believed by arguing with other people. They could see that maybe they had been wrong. A transcendentalist isn't always right. But usually because they don't always follow their heart. They want to, but it's really hard to separate out what you feel from what you're supposed to feel and from what everybody has always felt. And so it's often difficult to have an exact opinion, and so sometimes they were wrong. No truer American than Thoreau existed. His preference for his country and condition was genuine. His aversion from English and European manners and taste almost reached contempt. He listened impatiently to news or bon mot, the latest gossip or the latest slang, gleaned from London circles. And though he tried to be civil, these anecdotes fatigued him. These men are all imitating each other, and on a small mold. Why can they not live as far apart as possible and each be a man by himself? It's bad enough not being you, but to not even be an American? To import your culture from England? To wear English fashion? To use English catchphrases? You're as far from being you as you can get. So no wonder he despised it, and you can see how mad that must have made him when Emerson, who he had legitimately admired, comes back to America like an English lord. Idealist as he was, standing for the abolition of slavery, abolition of tariffs, almost for the abolition of government, and of course it isn't almost. Thoreau would gladly have seen the government go under. It is needless to say he found himself not only unrepresented in actual politics, but almost equally opposed to every class of reformer. Well, why would he be against reformers? They're trying to make the world better. Well, when we look at Self-Reliance by Emerson, you'll see that Emerson is against reformers too. Because reformers, let's say they're from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they want you to stop being a drunk, and you stop drinking. Is that enough for them? Do they let you alone? No, they want you to get a job, they want you to dress nicely, they want you to be nice to your wife and your children. They want you to stop smoking next. I mean, they want to turn you into this model citizen, their version of who you ought to be. So all reformers have to be resisted. Who's the only one who can reform you?
Yourself.
Yourself, because you're the only one who knows who you want to be. The reformers all have a generic ideal that they want people to live up to. Again, when he went out to support, it says when he went out to support John Brown, they warned him that there might be political repercussions, and he said, I didn't come to ask you what to say. I came to tell you I was going to speak. And there were an awful lot of people who thought that what Brown did had been terrible. But Thoreau, again, defends him as a transcendental hero. He had his truth, and he had to follow it. It wasn't Thoreau's truth, and it wasn't Thoreau's methods, and it wasn't Thoreau's materials. But they were John Brown's, and John Brown was entitled to that. Emerson builds him up physically, even though Thoreau had tuberculosis part of his life. And he wasn't real big. And he was pretty strong, and he was pretty well muscled. Emerson plays him up almost as a superhero. His senses were acute, his frame well-knit and hardy, his hands strong and skillful in the use of tools. Now remember, this is a guy who's never done a day's work in his life, Emerson, admiring the handiness of Thoreau. I mean, if you're a guy who keeps stabbing yourself with a screwdriver every time you try to operate it, almost anybody looks pretty miraculous to you. And Thoreau's a guy who's always worked for a living. There was a wonderful fitness of body and mind. He could pace 16 rods more accurately than any other man could measure them with rod and chain. Why am I not impressed by that? What did Thoreau do for a living? He was a surveyor. Watch a surveyor. He doesn't take a tape measure and measure out 100 yards. He sends his apprentice with that stick down and just says, when he looks through that transit, he's almost always dead on after he's been doing the job for a while. Well, Thoreau paces stuff off. So the fact that he can do it accurately, he wouldn't have been much of a surveyor if he hadn't learned to do that. In other words, it's the kind of stuff you learn from having a job. But to Emerson, who's never really had a job, it looks like it's miraculous. Or Emerson needs to try to find ways to make Thoreau look miraculous, and so this seems to him like it might be a convincing one. He could find his path in the woods at night, he said, better with his feet than his eyes. Well, that happens to be true. Emerson presents it as an insight, as a flash of enlightenment that Thoreau had. As it happens, you really can find your way better with your feet than your eyes. But for all we know, Thoreau bumped into tree after tree until finally said, just before the headache starts, there's a crunching sound. There's a crunching sound for a little while. And when I'm not hitting trees, there's no crunchy sound. And the reason for that? When you're on the path, all the leaves are all powder. Once you get off, you start stepping on old dead leaves, and they start making a lot of noise. So you don't need your eyes. You can just listen, and you know when you're off the path. But if Thoreau finds that out by trial and error, by bumping into trees continually, that's no magical insight. That's not a transcendental hero being given a special gift. In fact, to go back for a second to something that I started much earlier, when he makes that discovery about how to do the pencil, Emerson just tells you he did it. Like he had this brilliant insight out of nowhere, and he put together a hard pencil. He read an essay on French pencil making, and it talked about them using a certain kind of clay. It didn't say what it was, and it didn't say what the mixture was. Thoreau got a lot of different kinds of clay and experimented with different combinations until he found the one that worked. I don't know how many combinations he experimented with, but Ben Franklin could have come to that conclusion the same way. In other words, it wasn't the flash of enlightenment that Emerson keeps trying to present, nor may this have been. He could estimate the measure of a tree very well by his eye. Again, as a surveyor, one of his jobs would have been to give an estimate on how much a particular woods was worth. I'm going to sell those 5 acres of trees. What should I sell them for? Well, when he first starts out being a surveyor, he takes his tape measure and he measures every tree. And he counts up the board feet and he figures it out. But after you've been doing that for a while, you can pretty much look at a tree and go, that's 3 feet around and that's 2.5 feet. And there's about 40% 3-foot trees and about 15% 2. And you can make an estimate. It's nothing magical. It's just having done it a number of times. And we'd expect him to be able to guess how round a tree was because that was one of the things he did as his job. He could estimate the weight of a calf or a pig like a dealer. Well, how does a dealer get to estimate the weight of a calf or a pig? Practice. The guy who guesses your weight on the boardwalk is his summer job. Beginning of the summer, he's wrong all the time. End of the summer, he's hardly ever off by more than 2 pounds or 2 years because he's learned how to do it. And the same thing with a dealer. A dealer goes to the auctions, he looks at the pig, he guesses, they weigh it. Okay, he was off. Next time he's a little bit better. So if you want to assume that Thoreau was really gathering a bunch of tricks, and Emerson is certainly not the least gullible person around. Thoreau is you can see Thoreau as a 12-year-old who didn't have to go to school. And an auction was a social event. Thoreau could go to every auction. Even the dealers didn't make every auction. So Thoreau goes to the auction, and he says to himself, that's a 400-pound pig, and they weigh it, and it's a 200-pound pig. Okay, next time he's a little closer. When he gets really good, he takes Emerson with him. He says, okay, Waldo, how much does the pig weigh? Waldo says, 50 pounds, 1.5 tons? I'm guessing here. Give me a hint. And Thoreau says, 347 pounds. And they weigh it, it's 347 pounds. And what does Emerson say? He's at one with the oversoul. He's so in tune with nature, he knows the exact weight of the pig. But in fact, he's just gotten good at guessing it. A long, long time ago, I was a wrestling coach. I didn't have to put my wrestlers on the scale. I knew who was 2 pounds overweight the day of the match just by looking at them after a while. It's the same thing. It's the stuff you pick up from the job. But since Emerson doesn't do jobs, it looks like miracles to him, or he's pretending it looks like miracles to him so he can present this hero for us. This is the least amazing trick that he brings up. From a box containing a bushel or more of loose pencils, he could take up with his hands fast enough just a dozen pencils at every grasp. Well, why isn't that very impressive? Father had a pencil factory. How do you box pencils? By the dozen. You reach in, you wouldn't even, by the end of the summer you could do that. Go work in an assembly line. You got 3 bolts in different bins. And they differ by 1/16 of an inch. In the beginning of the summer, you're confusing them all the time. By the end of the summer, reach in and grab a handful, and you know when there's one in there that's the wrong size. 12 at a time. I mean, if he said you could shout a number out, 47, and Thoreau would get you 47 pencils, or 19 and he'd get you 19, that might be a little more impressive. But 12 at a time, anybody in Thoreau's family could have done that, because they'd worked there. He was a good swimmer. Of course he was a good swimmer. He didn't have to go to school. When Thoreau wanted to swim, he could go and swim. Everybody else swam on Sunday, on the weekend. What there was of the weekend. Thoreau's got all his free time. Same thing with being a great runner. Skater. Thoreau gets to practice all the time, and he was a good skater. I can't think of her name now. I can't think of anything. Hawthorne's wife wrote a little thing about them skating. And what they would do is at night, they would go down and build bonfires on the side of the lake, and everybody would skate. And she said that Thoreau was wonderfully athletic. He could do all these figures and things. And Emerson was like a big sail. He just held onto his coat and blew him across the lake, and then he got to the other side and it sort of blew him back. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was always falling down, but he was the best skater because he was so pretty. And Hawthorne was a good-looking guy. An old lady supposedly meets Hawthorne in the woods when he's young, and she thought he was an angel. He was so good-looking. But sure, Thoreau was a great skater, but we don't know how often Thoreau fell down learning those tricks when nobody's around on the pond. But we know that when Emerson shows up, Thoreau is doing figure 8s and 2 4s and a plus sign, and getting 9.5 from the Russian judge, because they hadn't been there watching him fall down all the times he fell down. He could probably outwalk most of his countrymen in a day's journey. Now, most people walked, but those who could afford had wagons, and others had horses. Thoreau walks more than everybody else. They walk out to the fields and they plow and they do things. Thoreau is always walking around in the woods, so no wonder he can outwalk anybody. And as far as him being a great boatman, even Hawthorne admits that. Now Hawthorne, when we get to Hawthorne, you'll see that Hawthorne is a guy who does not believe in the perfectibility of man. He hung out with the transcendentalists. He was with them, but he was never of them. He didn't believe in the goodness of man. And Hawthorne, in fact, is preoccupied with the nature of evil, and basically with who can you believe in. So he's not a guy that's impressed very easily. And whenever anybody did impress him, Hawthorne was kind of uncomfortable with that. So that you notice that when he talks about Thoreau, every time he says something good about him, he qualifies it. He says he's a good writer. At least the few things that I've read about him were interesting. He says he's well read for a transcendentalist, who Hawthorne thought read too much in spiritual things and not enough in practical things. He even spells his name wrong, but of course he had only been introduced to him. He'd never seen it printed. And Thoreau isn't necessarily a name that couldn't have been spelled a number of different ways. There's a big difference between Hawthorne's version and Emerson's version of Thoreau for one reason, not just because of the personalities of the men doing the judging, but because of the man they're looking at. Emerson is writing about a 44-year-old dead man. Hawthorne is writing about a 22-year-old who he thinks has a lot of potential, but has definitely not gotten it together. Now, if Thoreau says about you that you live an Indian kind of life, is it a compliment? If Thoreau says it. Yes, the Indians to him were the children of nature. They lived at one with it. Their whole environment, their whole culture was based on living with nature and being in harmony with nature. So they're the ultimate noble savage, and they're also the transcendental hero. So if Thoreau says you live an Indian kind of life, it's a compliment. How about if Hawthorne says you lead an Indian kind of life?
No, because they thought they were savages.
Yeah, he thought they were savages and they were lazy and they never held a job. And Thoreau never holds a job. So when he says that an Indian kind of life, he means a vagabond life with no real purpose to it, with no steady income. And he hopes, he says at the end of this thing, that when Thoreau goes and gets this job as a tutor, that will allow him to get himself together. In other words, he sees a young man he thinks is going to be somebody. He seems to have a lot of potential, but he definitely hasn't got it together as far as Hawthorne is concerned. One place, though, where Hawthorne is really impressed is with Thoreau's ability to row his boat. And that's kind of suspect, too. Thoreau didn't take just anybody on his walks. And yet he invites Hawthorne to go for one with him. Now Hawthorne didn't just go on walks with anybody. Hawthorne was a recluse. I mean, he's not Emily Dickinson, never see anybody kind of recluse. But if Hawthorne was walking down the road and saw a neighbor coming, he hid in the bushes so he didn't have to stop and talk to him. He was very shy, even into adulthood. He would sit up on top of a hill and people would go by and wave to him, and he would move around to the other side of the tree so he could ignore them. So him going on the walk is a little bit unlikely. But the two did seem to hit it off pretty well. They go on this walk and they come to, I forget whether it's the Concord or the Merrimack, but the little river that runs through Concord. And just as they get there, Thoreau's friend happens to row up in the boat that he has for sale. I find that a little questionable as a coincidence. And then Thoreau says, well, let me take you for a ride. Now, Hawthorne hurts his leg when he's a little kid, doesn't develop a lot of social skills, isn't a real athlete by any stretch of the imagination. So to him, Thoreau is a superhero. He rows the boat and he paddles the boat and he's just so amazing with it. I don't think that, say, Herman Melville would have been all that impressed. Melville had rowed a boat with a whale stuck on the other end of it in the open sea. He'd have probably said to Thoreau, not bad for a landlubber, Henry, but let me show you how a sailor does it. He'd have probably stood it up on end and taken it around the pond like a speedboat. But Hawthorne is really impressed with it. Thoreau tells us that when he met some Indians, they paddled exactly the same way he did. Now they're one with nature, so he's saying, basically, so am I. I have these same wonderful insights. But for all we know, Thoreau went around in circles for hours and hours before he decided, oh, if we put two oars in, we go straight ahead. Oh, that's amazing. This one turns left, this one turns right. But Emerson acts as if this was just this natural gift he had because he's a natural man. Even Hawthorne is impressed by it. Emerson goes way overboard in terms of these superhero gifts. Well, before I look at that, there's that section on the followers that he had. I've repeatedly known young men of sensibility converted in a moment to the belief that this was the man they were in search of, the man of men who could tell them all they should do. Boy, there's a mistake. Thoreau's the last person to tell them what they should do. His own dealing with them was never affection, but superior, didactic, scorning their petty ways, fairly slowly conceding or not conceding at all a promise of his society at their houses, or even at his own. Would he not walk with them? He did not know. It was nothing so important to him as his walks. He had no walks to throw away on company. Visits were offered him by respectful parties, but he declined them. Admiring friends offered to carry him at their own cost to the Yellowstone River, to the West Indies, to South America. But though nothing could be more grave or considered than his refusals, he nevertheless refused. Why doesn't Thoreau take these free trips? Free trip to South America. Why wouldn't Thoreau take an offer to have his teeth drilled without Novocaine for free? Think of what they're offering him here. A chance to go on a 40-foot boat with maybe 50 other people, total strangers, that you can't get off for 2 weeks. That's Thoreau hell. No wonder he didn't want to go. If you go, people pay your way. There's no such thing as a free lunch. They expect you're going to hang out with them. Now, Thoreau was the kind of guy who, when you got to South America, would say, when are we leaving again? 23rd? See ya. And come back on the 23rd. But he's still got that trip home and a trip down he's got to spend time with you. Thoreau doesn't want to do that. Even the people he liked, he didn't like for long periods of time. And he certainly couldn't have stood 2 weeks to anybody. So these offers really weren't much of a temptation to him. Secondly, he saw no reason to travel. Notice he says that when he read that book about the guy going to, I guess it was the North Pole, and the guy talked about 26 different kind of snows that the Eskimos were able to identify. And Thoreau says, I've seen every single one of them right here in Concord. You just have to be out in the snow every day looking at snow. Nobody else knows there are 26 kinds of snow because they're not out observing all the time the way Thoreau is. So these trips are really no temptation for him. I never seem able to find that quote, so I have to do it from memory. The snakes coiled around his legs, the fish swam into his hands. He plucked the woodchuck out of the hole by its tail, and the foxes put themselves under his protection. Now, assuming that Thoreau could do all of those things, that sounds like he's such a child of nature, nature just automatically comes to him. But in fact, there's a trick to every one of those, if you just watch wildlife a little bit. Snakes don't have ears, but they're very sensitive to vibration. Green snakes in particular like to coil, garden snakes. So you go for a walk with Emerson, you look around for turned over stones, like cemetery stones, for some knotted grass, because that's where they hang out. Then you stop and you start to talk to Emerson. While you do, you tap your foot. Well, that sets up vibrations. The green snake comes out, crawls back and forth over your foot a few times. It likes to coil. You wait until it starts to coil up your leg, and then you go, oh, look, Ralph. Now, Emerson doesn't know cobras from garden snakes, so he thinks everything is poisonous. He's running around screaming, snake, snake, snake. And Thoreau just picks it up by the tail and says, it's just our little narrow friend. And off he goes in the grass. And Emerson is amazed. Nature loves him so much the snakes coil around his legs. The fish swimming into his hands. You go on a picnic. You say, come on, Waldo, we're going to catch fish. We don't have any line. No problem, we'll do it by hand. So Emerson gets in the water, but the sun's in his eyes, so he turns around, and he's grabbing at the fish, and he's not catching anything. Thoreau's standing there still, and every minute or few minutes he flips a fish out of the water. The fish swim into their hands. He's so at one with nature they give themselves up to him. Or Thoreau knows the tricks. Thoreau knows that what fish like is shadows. So you stand facing the sun and you make a shadowed pool behind you. You don't keep grabbing at the fish because they've got a lateral line that's sensitive to vibration. As soon as you break the plane of the water, they're gone by reflex. Plus, they're not where you see them anyway because of the refraction of light. Thoreau stands with his legs apart, puts his hands about fish wide down in between them, and waits. Some fish swim around him, some fish swim outside of his hands, but every once in a while, they swim right in between him, and when he feels them, he just flicks them out of the water. It doesn't take any great hand speed. I could probably do it, old and slow as I am. But it seems miraculous. It's only not miraculous if you study fish, and you know about fish, and you know how it can be done. Plucking the woodchuck out of his hole. Okay, woodchucks aren't all that scary. You don't see people run, the woodchucks are coming, run, run. But I mean, if you've seen them around campus, the ones here, because they're unmolested, they're about the size of this desk. They have teeth about that big. How many of you would stick your hand in one of those holes out there? Well, you would if you knew the trick, which Thoreau does. Now, he's not only observed groundhogs a lot, but he's dug open groundhog burrows and he knows what they're like. They're a narrowing tunnel that then opens into a little room. Now, when a groundhog goes into his hole, how does he go in? Head first or tail first? Head first, because he's often being pursued. He doesn't have time to back in, and there's no reason for it. He goes in head first. When he gets to the far end, he gets into that little room, and he turns around and puts his mouth into that hole, because the hole narrows and brings the dogs after him so that they're kind of pinched in, and then he just bites them on the nose, and they go away. If you wait and stick your hand in there, you're going to get a nasty bite. But as long as you go in right after him, he can't hurt you, because he can't turn around in that tunnel. And they're not real flexible, so if you hold them out at arm's length, they're not going to swing up and bite you on the arm. But Emerson doesn't know that. Reach into the hole, pull out a woodchuck. They must love them because they don't bite them. But Thoreau knows. You wait 5 minutes and tell Thoreau, just stick your hand in cold to grab the woodchuck. Even Thoreau's thinking, I don't think so. You got to get him going in. But he doesn't tell Emerson that. And Emerson thinks, oh, it's the child of nature. As far as the foxes putting themselves under his protection, I don't think the foxes knew that he was Henry David Thoreau. What they did know was that the hunt generally broke off whenever they got near Thoreau's house. And the reason for that is, although Thoreau wasn't that big and imposing a guy, everybody knew he didn't kill anything, he loved animals, and he's nuts. So if you go chasing the animals and start bludgeoning the foxes to death in front of him, he may lose it entirely and be really dangerous. So we'll let the foxes go for today. And the foxes notice, hey, every time we run over here, the hunt stops. Let's start running over here all the time. It hasn't got anything to do with knowing it's Thoreau or being a child of nature. It's one of those things about Thoreau's reputation exceeding it. But the only place where Emerson really makes comments on Thoreau which aren't positive are when he talks about Thoreau's writing. The habit of a realist to find things the reverse of their appearance inclined him to put every statement in a paradox. Paradox, remember, from the metaphysical. It seems to be a contradiction. You look a little bit further into it and you find out that it isn't. A trick of rhetoric not quite outgrown in his later of substituting for the obvious word and thought its diametrical opposite. He praised wild mountains and winter forests for their domestic, their homely air. In snow and ice he would find sultriness, heat, and commended the wilderness for resembling Rome and Paris. It was so dry you might call it wet. Why did Thoreau do that? Remember, that's his way of training you to have a transcendental moment. If you're going to see the world differently, you've got to see it from a different angle. By his writing, he continually gets you to expect the opposite of anything you look at. And that creates in the reader the habit of looking for the opposite in everything they see. And of course, if you're going to have new insights, that's one way to have it. Always look at the thing for what it can't be. Find some way that it can. And that'll give you that unique vision. It's really Thoreau's way of training his readers to have a transcendental insight. And here's Emerson, the theoretician of the whole movement, and he doesn't understand that. I think it's a lot of time when Emerson really doesn't seem to understand his own philosophy. So basically what you have then with Emerson is him creating an ideal, and Hawthorne not needing to have that hero worship form. Emerson does say, there's another trick. Let me tell you this last one and then we'll stop. Emerson says that it's like the Indians, he's at one with the Indians, and he finds arrowheads. And Hawthorne says it's like the Indians have adopted him. He can find traces of them everywhere. And that sounds like they're at one with nature, he's at one with nature, naturally he can see where they are. That trick of finding arrowheads, first of all, isn't that difficult. All you have to do is, while you're walking around, you look for some flint, because that's what they made them out of. Then you say, okay, there's some flint. Now, would they have sat out there in the hot sun? Or would they have stayed over there under that tree near the water where they could dip them and wash them off and look at the edge? Well, obviously under the tree. But everybody's found those. The place to look is about 30 or 50 yards out from the tree in a circle, because whenever they break one, that's where they heave it. So you walk out there, you keep looking, you notice one, you put your foot over it, you turn the conversation to Indians. Hawthorne says, yes, they're all gone and all trace of them. Thoreau says, why, look, here's an arrowhead right here. And even Hawthorne goes, ooh. Or for all we know, Thoreau carried arrowheads in his pocket. He had a little hole, he dropped them, he put his foot on it, talked about the Indians. Oh, here's one, and here's another one behind your ear, Hawthorne. Isn't that an amazing place for them to have left? Maybe Thoreau was just a really bright con man who used transcendentalism as a way to get some attention from people. Or maybe Emerson is right, that he really was a transcendental hero who insisted on being himself, and maybe it was somewhere in between. Next week we'll finish up Emerson with self-reliance, and then we'll be on Thoreau. So we will have the quiz on Thoreau. We'll probably be doing Whitman too. Well, let me put it, wait. Do you want to have the quiz on, we're going to do probably Thoreau and Whitman next week. Do you want to do